Hello, Dr. Cath here again, and this time, because we've got the COP26 conference on in Glasgow at the moment, you'll be hearing an awful lot in your newspapers and news feeds about climate change. So today, we're going to talk about climate change, how it affects Shropshire's wildlife. So here we go, Shropshire wildlife and climate change. Due to increasing temperatures, biodiversity in the UK has actually never been higher in human history, which sounds really positive. But is it? What's actually happening? Well, despite what it feels like, summer temperatures are rising. All of the top 10 warmest years for the UK, in records going back to 1884, have occurred since 2002. And for central England, the 21st century so far has been warmer than all of the previous 3 centuries. In the last 30 years, 1991 to 2020, it's been nearly a degree centigrade warmer than the preceding 30 years from 1961 to 1990. The warming trend is evident across all months and all regions of the UK. So temperature is thought to be what actually drives most wildlife responses. As well as increased temperatures in the UK, it's been a lot wetter, on average 6% wetter in the last 30 years. 6 of the 10 wettest years recorded in the UK since 1862 have occurred since 1998, so it is getting wetter. You're not wrong when you think that. All those barbecue summers we're promised that never seem to happen. Basically, if the ice sheets are melting, what goes up must come down. So we are getting wetter. 2020 was the first year that the annual values for rainfall, temperature and sunshine were all in the top 10 in the same year. It was the 3rd warmest, the 5th wettest and the 8th sunniest on record. I think it could do a little bit better on the sunny front, but there we go. Last year also saw some significant weather extremes, including severe flooding from heavy rainfall in February and a major heat wave in early August. There were 10 named storms. That's the big storms that really do cause damage. This is the flooding in Shropshire caused by Storm Dennis. Absolutely remarkable, large areas of the countryside and absolutely inundated, and of course a lot worse in other parts of the country. What's it doing for our wildlife? Basically, if the environment a creature can live in, which is referred to as its climate envelope, disappears or changes too much, the creature must either move, adapt, or die. Wildlife inhabiting the edge zones of the UK, which is places like the tops of mountains and the north of Scotland, the Arctic alpine species, for example, will be hit first and hit hardest. And Shropshire doesn't really have any of those extreme habitats. So we will see a more muted response. This is the snowfield willow, dwarf willow, that you find on the high ground in the Grampians and places like that. And these species are declining rapidly, but we don't suffer from that in Shropshire too much. It doesn't mean that we're not seeing changes now, and we're not going to see more. There's upsides and downsides of climate change. There's negative impacts, obviously. There's what we hear most about, which is more frequent extreme weather events like the violent storms and the flooding, possible drought, consequent drying up of wetlands, the improved suitability of the climate for non-native invasive species, things that have come from more tropical countries previously would just die out here in the winter and now some of them are managing to survive. We're losing the synchronicity between breeding bird populations and their prey, particularly the caterpillars and the insects. But there are more positive effects. Species are expanding from the southern parts of the country, which need slightly warmer conditions, and it's becoming more suitable for those species here now. Non-migrant species are breeding earlier. They're surviving better over winter, particularly creatures such as wrens and tree creepers, the insectivores. Their small body size means that they lose heat very quickly, and very cold spells, prolonged cold spells particularly, can really bring about a crash in the population of these little birds, and they're doing much better due to the milder winters. Barn owls also are helped by milder winters. They can suffer badly in very cold winters. They're right at the northern edge of their range here at the moment in the UK, but obviously warmer conditions are going to help them. They don't do very well in heavy rain, unfortunately, so prolonged rainy periods aren't going to help them, but the warmth will. There's also improved conditions for egg laying and larval development in insects such as dragonflies. But remember, there's a downside as well, that pest species that we all relied on the cold winters to eradicate in our gardens can now survive over the winter. So lots of things going on. And how do we organise this? Perhaps it's best to look at it group by group. It's very difficult to pin down causes of population changes, as this is definitely to do with climate change, or whether there's other issues like habitat loss or habitat alteration. So starting off with the plants. You'll have noticed changes in your garden. Your lawn needs mowing earlier and later in the year because the growing season has lengthened. Spring flowers are coming into bloom a lot earlier, but their flowering season may be shorter. Plants are also moving, increasing their range northwards as seed can develop in the warmer soils. So things like southern marsh orchid are increasing all over the county. Climate warming is helping orchid species in general all over the country. So who knows what might turn up once you've got a bit more warmth for them. Trees at this time of year, we once would have expected them to be all turned, many of them bare. I'm looking out of the window today and we're at the end of October and quite a lot of the leaves are still green. So they're holding on to their leaves longer and changing colour later. There's a possibility that garden plants, which are brought from more Mediterranean climates, for example, Southern European climates, may escape from gardens and be able to survive in the wild. It's nice if in your garden you don't have to fuss about them so much, but we don't really want them going berserk all over the countryside. Other native plants can actually also cause problems. Bracken, for example, is increasing in upland areas, and that one is due to climate change, so on the Longmynd and places like this. So there's a danger that these plants will overshadow and outcompete the more montane species. So these are things to watch out for. Just how things change gradually. The trouble with things changing gradually is very hard to pinpoint, but do keep an eye on things, because A, it's interesting, and B, It's the only way we know that things are changing, things are developing, and what needs to be protected. There's a danger that we'll have a sort of homogenization. The generalist species will flourish, and the more specialist, more niche environments species will be lost. Spring flowering, of course, impacts on the pollinating insects. Bees have had a bit of a tough time with the pesticides and things, and some of them are doing all right with the climate warming, and some of them less so. So the early emerging bees, things like the early bumblebees, the white-tailed bumblebees, and buff-tailed bumblebees, it's going to be quite good for them because they've got that extra pollen early in the season. Garden bumblebees have been recorded active throughout the winter in southern parts of the country, not in Shropshire yet. So we don't know whether they're going through the dying out of colonies and starting of new ones, or whether the colonies are just continuing through the year. But they are active on mild days in winter. Of course, this has a bit of an impact on things like the bilberry bumblebee. This is one of our prized species in Shropshire, if you like. It's a threatened species. It's totally an upland thing. We have it on the Long Min, Stones, Craddock, these sort of places. And as the southern bee species are moving north, these bees that really have nowhere to move to, they can't go higher up because they're already at the top of the hills, and there isn't anywhere close that they can move to. They're getting pinched out a bit. These are late emergence, and there's a danger that the early emergence will be moving higher up the mountains, be able to survive higher up the hills, and they will outcompete the bilberry bumblebees for nesting places, for example. There's only so many mouse holes, so they could be pinched out by those more common, more widespread bees. This is a perfect example of a specialist species which is most at risk from climate change. Butterflies and dragonflies are particularly well monitored. They're very popular. Lots of people count them, monitor them, photograph them through the summer, and they give us a very good vision of what's happening. The less well monitored groups, problem is there's nothing to compare the current population to. If nobody was monitoring them 20 years ago or 30 years ago, we don't really know what was going on. Dragonflies are doing very well. Their ranges are increasing. New immigrant species are appearing. This is new to the UK, not just to Shropshire. They're one of the groups that the warmer conditions really help them lay more eggs. They're in better condition to lay more eggs, and the larvae develop faster. I mean, some of the northern species of them can spend 2 or 3 years in the larval form in the streams and ponds, and if they can develop quicker, obviously they breed faster. So this is one of the immigrants, if you like. This is the lesser emperor dragonfly, and first seen in 2016, again in 2019. So it came into East Anglia, the south and in the southeast of the country, and it's moved this far. So we are seeing them, not breeding here yet. Small red-eyed damselfly is first recorded in Essex in 1999. It had got to Shropshire by 2019, and it's now breeding here. It's at the Dudmaston estate. It's also been seen at Wixwell Moss, so a pretty thing to look out for, and a new one to record for Shropshire. This is the willow emerald damselfly, and it hasn't got here yet, but it's got as far as Warwickshire. as far north as Yorkshire and as far west as Warwickshire, so could be appearing in a pond near you soon. Do watch out for that one, and do report these things. Dragonflies are really good responders to climate warming. They're highly mobile and they're adventurous. Of course, the downside is that we might lose other species that are at the southern edge of their range, which includes the white-faced darters, which are doing very well at Wixall at the moment, but because they're at the southern edge of their range, they could find it problematic. Interestingly, the darker coloured dragonflies like this one are adapted to cold climate. So you can tell this is not a dragonfly that likes Mediterranean heat much. And what about the butterflies? So another well-studied group. There does seem to have been a lack of butterflies around. But there's an awful lot of other things impacting on butterflies. They're one of the ones that they can be put into severe difficulties by severe weather events. If particularly those ones that have a short flight period, if it absolutely pours down when they're emerging and looking for mates and wanting to breed, really a heavy shower can completely destroy them. But we're seeing positive impacts. Red admirals like this one are now surviving hibernation here. They used to all be migrants, but they've joined our other hibernating butterflies, like the brimstones and the small tortoiseshells and the peacocks, and they're surviving well here, which means, of course, they're here sooner in the summer and can't start breeding sooner. We've got species expanding northwards. This is a silver-washed fritillary, beautiful thing, and they're increasing. The warmer springs and summers are very good for fritillaries in general. So these are expanding their range and coming north into Shropshire and further into Shropshire gradually as time goes by. So I'm looking forward to seeing them up round here in the north of Shropshire very soon. The warm summers, because the warm springs and summers are good for them because the larvae develop much more quickly, which means they're less in danger of being eaten by predators. So the quicker you can get through that difficult phase of being a caterpillar and being everything's favourite food, the better. And this species is now commoner in the region than it's ever been, so doing very well. Other increasing species include white admirals, brown arguses, marbled whites, a lovely little butterfly. And these are all increasing in Shropshire. Downside again, though, large heaths, their range is declining. They're more of a northern butterfly, and again, common on the mosses and these sort of places, but climate change isn't going to do them any favours. Population crashes after severe weather events quite often don't actually cause totally disastrous effects. They might have an impact for a year or two, but then a good year and everything gets back on its feet again. So far, we haven't seen any species lost through being deluged or flooded. Other insects are probably very under-recorded. Ladybirds are quite popular and quite easy one. You know, the bees, ladybirds, butterflies, dragonflies, fine. But the smaller things like sort of earwigs and millipedes and springtails and stuff tend to be very under-recorded. So it's a bit hard to work out what's going on. A sudden new species that's never been recorded before in Shropshire might just be that nobody's ever found it before, or that somebody who studies that particular group has moved to Shropshire. So it's a bit hard to tell what's actually happening. This one's a new immigrant. This is a Bryony ladybird. And again, they came into the southeast of the country. They're probably a natural immigrant. And they've been recorded in Warwickshire, so that's another one to watch out for fairly soon. Don't do much damage. They mostly live on white bryony, but apparently have started eating things like melon plants and cucumber plants. So watch out for that one in your garden. It's quite a distinctive little creature and really rather cute. Oh, might just be my attitude. There is a danger from invasives that are brought in on garden plants. For example, the harlequin ladybirds. These arrived in Britain in 2006 and, of course, have spread throughout the country. Improving climate means that quite a lot of, some of these came from Asia, but the improving climate means they have a chance of surviving. Reptiles, this is one that you're going to notice in your garden, reptiles and amphibians. So if you've got a garden pond, you might have noticed that the frogs are spawning earlier. Sometimes it works for them very well and they grow well and develop well and you get a really good crop of frogs. And sometimes they get caught out by a late frost, which can be fairly devastating when you see all your frog spawn frozen in the pond. There's also possible problems with hibernation for amphibians because their metabolic slowdown is reduced in warmer weather. They tend to wake up more, and of course food is very scarce then, so it can have an impact. But generally speaking, if they're not getting frozen, they have more chance. So hopefully we'll be seeing better survival rates of these creatures. There's a bit of an impact on the reptile species that bear live young. If you watched the Here Be Dragons talk a few weeks ago, you'll remember that most of the reptiles in Shropshire actually bear live young, and this is an adaptation to colder climates. So people like this viviparous lizard may have problems breeding as the weather gets warmer. They're not really warm weather things. So just a warning. It might be that they'll be fine. It might be that they can move themselves to some slightly cooler places. Maybe they're ones that are going to go uphill a bit. But there could be a problem there. What about the fish? Don't really see fish very much apart from the leaping salmons at this time of year in the Severn. But there they all are in the waterways, and cold water species like salmon and trout are going to be hit by warming water and deoxygenation. Warm water holds less oxygen than cold water, and salmon and trout need well oxygenated water, particularly when they're spawning. So even with low greenhouse gas emissions, salmon are expected to vanish from half their current range by 2070. That's, some of you could still be alive then. With high emissions, it could be almost 80% of their range, which is most of England, half of Wales, and half of Scotland. So these cold water fish, these are the glacial survivors, most of them, could be under threat. Of course, the niche that they leave will be adopted by something else. For example, these carp, which are non-indigenous, they were imported here, and they might dominate the freshwater that at the moment we have salmon and trout in. And they're not a very tidy fish. They tend to grub about in the bottom, they muddy the water, they disturb the plants, and the impact on freshwater invertebrates, for example, could be noticeable. If you like carp, though, lots of people do, it's very good for them. Birds, of course, are highly mobile. These are the creatures that find it easiest to move themselves. and moving long distances as well. So range expansion is going on northwards. We've got, for example, Chetty's warblers, which first established themselves in the UK in 1973, are now resident in Shropshire. They haven't yet been recorded breeding, but it's only a matter of time. New species coming in, again, non-breeders, include the little egrets and the great white egrets. We're seeing more and more of them, particularly around the meres and mosses areas, anywhere there's good wetland environment. These are both breeding in the UK, obviously not up here yet. There's cattle egrets, little bitterns and purple herons increasingly seen in southern counties. I have to admit, I'm really looking forward to the day I look out at the heronry on Ellesmere and see egrets in with the herons, because of course these are species that will join in with established heronries. Bee-eaters have been nesting in Hertfordshire last year. These things are moving about. They are adopting the country as their own, and we will see new breeding species of birds establish themselves in Shropshire, which is really pretty exciting. We might lose breeders that are on the southerly edge of their range, though. This is a ring ouzel. They haven't bred here for a while. There's been a sharp decline in recording of species since 1979. They move north and uphill. These are birds that rely very much on soil invertebrates. They're like the thrushes and the blackbirds. They're taking worms and things. So hot summers are actually pretty bad for them. They need the soft, damp ground to catch their prey. And this is impacting not only the thrushes, but also things like waders, plovers, anything really that needs to get those worms out of the soil. Migrants have particular problems. This is a willow warbler, and their problem is that they synchronize their breeding so that when the chicks are hatching is when the big influx of caterpillars are hatching out as well. And the caterpillar, the insects have actually they're breeding earlier, and the birds aren't quite managing to catch up with them. So if you haven't synchronized yourself properly, when your chicks hatch, there might be a shortage of food. And this impacts on resident birds like great tits just as much, but more so on migrants. Great tits have actually moved their breeding time by a couple of weeks now. They haven't quite caught up with the insects, the moths and things, but they're getting there. Migrants aren't so flexible. They have a long way to travel to get here, and if they don't know what's, obviously if they're in sub-Saharan Africa, they don't really know what's going on here. So they can be hard hit by that change in phenology, changing when things are happening in the springtime. Of course, there's some of them are managing to get around it. This is what they call plasticity, plastic adaptation. This is individuals, not a genetic adaptation. And things like pied flycatchers, very reliant for their chicks on the caterpillars on things like on the oak trees, and traditionally breeding in deciduous woodlands. But because of the lack of caterpillars at the right time of year, they're actually moving into mixed woodland because it offers a much better chance of there being different species of caterpillars which are out at the right time. So we're finding them much more in mixed woodland now. They're changing their preference. So that's an adaptation of individual birds. That's not a genetic adaptation at all. So they can do it. They can be flexible. Migrants are also, of course, at risk when they're not here at all, and climate change affects that. Either winter visitors on their breeding grounds up north, or the summer visitors while they're on migration to get here. Tundra breeders, for example, some of the waders can be affected by the tundra warming up, and their nest sites may no longer be available. Migrants from sub-Saharan Africa are severely impacted by drought and desertification in the Sahel, the area below, just to the south of the Sahara. So it does make a difference to them. Mammals, of course, aren't nearly as mobile, but warmer winters are helping a lot of species, hibernators, survive better and go into the breeding season in better condition. And badgers have been recorded as being much fatter and much fitter in spring. Now we don't have very cold winters. That means they can produce more cubs. And generally thriving really on the warming conditions. So they eat a lot of worms, so damp soil is good for them, but they're quite versatile. They can actually forage on a lot of different things. Bats might have problems if they get brought out of hibernation by warm weather too soon, but again, they seem to be doing quite well. And we've even got a new species has joined the fauna. This is Nethusias pipistrelle, which is actually a wide-ranging migrant bat, but has a widening British distribution now. It's spreading to the north and west, and has been breeding in the UK since 1997, and has been recorded in Shropshire. So if you're good at telling bats apart, which to admit I'm not very, or you've got a bat detector, this is one to watch out for. These are new species coming to join us. And how exciting is that? So what can we do about all this? We can leave things to get on with it, see how the adaptations work out. But one of the most important things is the nature recovery network, because these species that don't adapt, they have to move, need to be able to move through the countryside, and they can't do it if they're one of the less mobile species and there isn't a route with suitable habitat that they can move through. So it's all right if you're a bird, you can fly over it, but if you're a beetle, perhaps, or an amphibian, or a small mammal, you need to have a corridor. And at the moment, we're surveying all over the county for potential routes for improving nature recovery networks. And these can be all sorts of things, like they could be a riverbank or a canal bank or hedgerows, connecting up pieces of habitat so that creatures can move from one to the other. I mean, if you think about it, even if you've got the world's most suitable habitat for example, a natterjack toad, and you build a lovely sand dune in the middle of Birmingham, there is no way the natterjack toad can get there. So it needs to have roots. I mean, natterjack toad's a bit of an extreme example, but you can imagine it being the same for many, many species that aren't quite as mobile as the birds and dragonflies. So support nature recovery networks. Record what you see. This is the only way that we know what's actually moving about. So any sort of, whatever your speciality is, there could well be a recording system for it. Certainly there is with birds and the butterflies and the dragonflies and things. You can add your records to everybody else's, and it builds up a good picture of how climate change is affecting the country and the county, and hopefully it will also show us when improvements are happening. So recording is very important. And of course, the most important thing is looking after the habitats we have. Species on the edge of their climatic envelope will survive if the habitat is robust, but they won't if it's marginal. So looking after our wild places, our reserves, all the other special habitat we have in Shropshire gives creatures time to adapt, and if they can adapt, they don't have to move. So look after the habitats, and of course, don't forget the best way to do that is, ta-da, join Shropshire Wildlife Trust. We have over 40 reserves that all offer special habitats for the more unusual creatures we have in Shropshire. So these are places that things that don't necessarily thrive in our gardens can actually make a proper living in Shropshire. So give us a hand, join us, and help us look after all those nice wild spaces and look after those poor creatures so they don't have to move and they have the time to adjust themselves. So lots of good going to be happening, lots of things to watch out for, and as long as we don't go too far with it. Thank you very much.